Hi there, this is Stephen Roselle again. I'm going to do a quick kind of tips and tricks tutorial on how to go about using the PolyReduction tool on higher resolution meshes. So what we have here is a model that you've seen probably in some of the other blog posts that I've done. This is a model I sculpted out on Mudbox, and this is a pretty high resolution version of this model. This is actually a million polys, 1.16 million polys. And depending on how I built this, I may very well have the original base mesh that I can use as an LOD, say for instance for like an in-game mesh or something. And I may not have to worry about it, but in other cases I may start with a high-res mesh and I may not actually have a low-res mesh to work with. So I have to generate a low-res from this. So I'm going to use the PolyReduction tool for this. So the PolyReduction tool is just under Mesh, Reduce, and I'm going to go to Options and make a few changes here. Now, one of the first things I want to point out is that one of the biggest mistakes people make with dealing with high-res reduction is that they try to do it all in one pass, which is almost impossible, or it's very difficult, rather. So what I'm going to do is actually create a copy of this just for comparison's sake, and we'll just pull this off to the side. You'll notice there are textures and UVs on here right now. I'm just going to turn those off for now. We'll come back to that. But I'm going to do a first pass reduction on this head right here. Now, a couple of things I want to do. I'm going to check my poly count. I can do the math here. About 1 million polygons. If I do a 95% reduction, that's going to leave me with about 50,000 polygons, give or take. Now, I also want to keep quads on because I'm actually reducing a quad mesh. So you can see I have a nice, smooth, clean quad distribution here for my mesh. Now, if I didn't have that, I wouldn't necessarily need it, but I want to preserve that if at all possible. Now this next attribute, face compactness, is a bit tricky. It's basically a ratio between, or rather a bias from preserving the shape versus preserving a cleaner quad structure. So if I dial this down, then I'm going to preserve, it's going to pay more attention to preserving the shape. If I dial it up, it's going to pay more attention to giving me a cleaner layout of faces. So when I do my first pass, I'm actually going to dial this down to about 25%. Now, caching, I'm going to turn it off for now because I don't need it on this high resolution version. And then I'm also going to turn off all these preserve attributes for now because I don't really care about the borders for this mesh. I don't really care about the UVs because I'm going to actually recreate them later. And then hard edges I don't want because I'm actually going to be generating hard edges along the way and I don't want to preserve those right now. So with these settings, I'll just simply click apply. Now rather than make you wait for this, this would probably take about 2 minutes to actually run through the reduction. So I've actually created if I just get rid of that guy, I've actually created a layer here that simply has the reduction already in it. So again, this took about 2 minutes for me to reduce using those exact settings. And I want to point out that if you have a multi-core system, it will actually improve your performance because this is actually a multi-threaded process. Another thing to point out is that 64-bit system will give you a better performance as well because it'll give you more access to RAM for high resolution meshes and so on. So definitely the system you have affects the performance while you're working, but you can still kind of go through the same process regardless. Now the next thing I want to do is actually do another phase of reduction. You can see here that I've done a reduction and it's preserved the shape of my mesh quite nicely. I'm down to, again, 50,000 polys. So now what I want to do is create a copy of this guy, again, just for comparison's sake. And I'll pull that off to the side, and we'll do a second pass reduction on this middle object here. So I'll go back into my reduce options. I'll just get them through the marking menu this time. And this time, a couple of changes I'm going to make. What I want to do first is go in and actually, I'll just do the same reduction at 95%. And this time I'm actually going to dial up the face compactness, and I'll show that in a second, but I'm basically going to bias this just a little bit more towards giving me cleaner faces, or cleaner, kind of more evenly distributed faces. I'm also going to turn on caching, so this will be interactive, and again I'm going to turn all this other stuff off. So I'll do a reduction. This will just take a few seconds, and you can see quickly I was able to reduce this down to 2,700 polys. So a couple things to point out. Because I used the caching, I wouldn't use the caching on the high resolution, but once you get down to 100,000 poly range, you can actually use caching, which will basically allow you, oops, changed the wrong attribute there, which will basically allow you to dynamically go in and retessellate this. So accidentally changed my compactness there. Let me set that back to 0.75 where I was. Now the caching works with a percentage. It doesn't work with a compactness attribute there. So now I can actually go in and I can interactively dial this up and down. And if I track my poly count up here, I can just keep dialing my percentage up until I get to roughly 2,000 polygons. So now I'm going to actually stop there at 1998. So now I can just show you the difference between your compactness attributes. So if I set my compactness up to 1, you can see that I get a very different layout. I get these nice kind of uniform looking polygons, these uniform looking faces. But I start to lose some of the actual shape. You'll particularly notice in the eye and in the nose. So if I dial this down to 0, then I get the opposite result. It preserves the shape really well, but now I get these kind of ugly, kind of gnarly looking faces. And in some cases I'll even get, actually, like if you look at the lips in particular, I'll get these really ugly faces along the lips. So this is where we gotta kind of make a trade-off. I'm gonna dial this up towards a bias towards the shape. So I'll dial this up to about 0.8, and I'll get a pretty good combination. So it'll preserve the shape fairly well, but at the same time, it will give me a fairly decent layout for my quads. I might even want to go down to 7.5 where I originally started. Again, this is kind of trial and error a bit, but that's good for now. Now the next step is to actually take this a little bit further and do some manual edits. So one thing that you'll notice is that the symmetry of my character has been, it's still kind of there, but it's been lost to a certain extent. If I actually look at my high resolution, you can see that I've actually got variation. Let's pull back. So you can see I've got scars in the forehead. I've got kind of different details in my high-res mesh, which once I start to reduce this down to a lower level will become more obvious. So because I have a symmetrical character, the low-res poly should be fairly symmetrical as well. So what I can do is I can go to bonus tools and use this tool under modeling called mirror instance, which will basically allow me to take this mesh and then mirror it along the x-axis, which would be right to left, or left to right, depending on how you look at it. So now I've basically got a symmetrical character, and this is actually symmetrical as far as editing goes as well. So if I move a component, or if I were to go in and do something like, say, an edge loop edit. So let's say I wanted to get rid of this edge loop right here. I'll just use my control right marking menu to do an edge loop delete. That'll delete that entire loop all the way down both sides of my character. So now I can go in and I can begin to get rid of some of these other edge loops. Let's get rid of that one right there. I'll pull around to the side. Whoops, that guy could get in the way. Pull around to the side, maybe grab this loop here, just hit G. Once you apply it once, then I can go in and I can just hit G to repeat that. And you could do multiple edge loops at the same time as well. Let's get rid of this edge loop here. And lastly, I've got a couple of edge loops that I might want to get rid of in here. So actually, that's good enough. So I probably could take that a little bit further, but I'm going to leave it at that. Now that I've got some pretty decent looking symmetry, I want to combine this all back together into single mesh. So right now you can clearly see there's a distinction between my meshes. So rather than doing a normal combine, what I'm going to do is under bonus tools, go under modeling and do a merge and combine. Merge and combine will not only combine it, but it will also stitch up that interior edge. So now if I disable this, you can see there that I've got some pretty kind of ugly looking faceted faces. This is just a result of the reduction. All I have to do is just grab this and just go into my soften tool and just soften edges mode and just soften those edges out. So before I take it any further, or before I finish rather, I want to take it one step further, and that is to make sure that the volume of my reduced object matches the volume of my original object. And I can actually use this kind of middle res version here. So because of your reduction, you're actually changing the shape and the volume slightly and subtly, even though you may not visually see it all the time. So what I can do, let's actually hide that first mesh for now and turn on my wireframe so I can see what's going on here. What I can do is I can do a transfer attributes and transfer the shape of the high res to this other object. So I'm going to go in here to my mesh menu, go to transfer attributes, and in the options, I'm going to switch this from UV mode into vertex position. I also am going to do a closest along normal match. So what that will do is it will use this as my source object, this is my target object, and all these points will match the nearest point along the normal on this target object. I want to switch this to local space because these are offset Otherwise, they'd have to be overlapped. And now I just simply say apply, and it'll be very subtle, but what you'll notice is if I undo and redo that, if I undo, that was before. If I redo, that's after. So they're very subtle variations. The cool thing about this, though, is this is dynamically linked. So now I can manually edit this a little bit more. So let's say, for instance, here where the lips are, I might actually want to go in and grab this edge loop between these 2 points, and I might want to actually move those. If I move those now, you'll see if I pull those out, they never actually leave the surface. So if this is bound to a virtual version of that other surface. So I can begin to move these edges literally along the lip line of the other object, and they're not going to ever actually displace or offset from that object as long as I move them within kind of a relative mode. So now I can kind of slide this edge again along that target surface, and you can work in edge mode or you can work in vert mode. So I can grab a vert here, and again, if I try to pull that out, it's never going to pull away from the surface. It's just going to slide along that surface. So I can do a lot of corrective kind of edits on this object just by going in and kind of moving some verts around. And I can also turn on my reflection. Actually, right now I'm not working with reflection on, so I might actually want to just toggle on reflection so I can find that match along the other side. And now I can just slide that point there kind of along the surface. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do here is make sure that my UVs were created correctly. If I turn off my wireframe and I turn on my textures, what you'll notice is that, actually let's bring up my original mesh for this to do the comparison. So what you'll notice is that the textures, even though the character is fairly symmetrical, the textures are actually different from side to side. And because I mirrored that over here, I've actually got a situation where I've got the texture mirrored over. So if I look at my UV shell, I've only got half of my UVs. So what I want to do is actually preserve that. And for performance reasons, I'll actually use the UVs from this one. So let's take a look at the UVs here. So you can see there the UVs associated with the texture on my mid-res there. So I'm going to actually shift select now my target, which is my low-res object. I'll go into my my transfer attributes tool, and because I've gone through that extra step of doing the transfer of position, I can ensure that these are actually sharing the same volume, same space. So now that I'm going to turn off position, I'm going to turn on UV sets. Again, I'll do local mode and simply transfer. And now when that's done, you'll see there, if I do the before and after, that was before I transferred, and that was after. So now you can see there that I've got the same texture layout. If I go back into the UV editor, you can see that my UVs are now correct. So several steps involved, but the main point again is that I was able to go from about 1 million polygons down to less than 1,000, 1,784. I probably could have even pushed it a little bit further, but I was able to do that pretty nicely and pretty smoothly. Once you've done this a couple of times, you get the hang of it, and even though it's somewhat manual, it's a fairly fast process. So thanks for your time.